Hi, today's February 27th, 2024. I'm honored to have with me today Aaron Day, fellow at the Brownstone Institute. Aaron, and former presidential candidate. He's an entrepreneur, a crypto expert, and he's got a few warnings for us. Tell us, Aaron, what have you been up to, and what are the things on the horizon people should be aware of?
Well, I have basically, thank you for having me. I've basically dropped everything that I'm working on to focus on what I think is the single biggest threat to human liberty, which are central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. CBDCs are a programmable form of digital money that allows or will allow the government to monitor, censor, and program your money. So it's basically the gateway to complete digital tyranny. It's the basis for things like social credit systems, digital IDs, vaccine passports, etc. Because once the government can control and shut off your money, they can control your ability to protest, engage in political activity. Basically, they can control whatever they want. And this is something that is a much bigger, nearer term threat than I think the majority of people are aware of. So I'm trying to warn people about this and also empower them to do something about it, which is largely to exit the dollar and move into self-custody, crypto, gold, and silver, and use those alternatives as cash in a parallel economy, which I can get into more of the specifics of why that's the solution and kind of the ins and outs of that. But that's the thumbnail of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it.
So we had this little virus scare a couple of years ago. People, it was the biggest dystopia perpetrated on the American public in recent memory. I think there are places, probably in North Korea, whatnot, that might not have found COVID lockdowns too much of a difference in their, existence. But we see that, the state has an appetite. It doesn't necessarily have to be fully truth-based, and control seems to be part of it. Once there's, I use a credit card, and I didn't for a long time, as back into my 20s and whatnot, and friends recommended them. I'm like, whatever, but clearly they have some benefit. You can kind of move around nicely. You can swipe things now, go by with your, smartphone and so forth. People love that convenience. How do people kind of exist in a mobile, world where convenience, nobody wants to be that person at the grocery, pulling out pennies and nickels and whatnot, or writing a check anymore, when everyone's behind you in line wanting to swipe to get their Starbucks and so forth. What's the kind of the tension point between convenience and caution?
Well, there's a bigger issue here, which is the issue isn't whether you're using the dollar in a digital form or a physical form. The issue is the actual dollar itself. It's fiat currency. And this is something, and I actually wrote a book called The Final Countdown that goes into this in great detail. But the dollar is almost certainly going to collapse. Every fiat currency like the dollar in human history has failed. There have been thousands of them. There was a guy that did an analysis of 775 fiat currencies. They all failed. The average fiat currency only exists for about 27 years. And even if you look at global reserve currencies like the dollar, the last 5 global reserve currencies have only lasted for, on average, 94 years. And the dollar has well extended that. We're well over 100 years. And the reason fiat currencies collapse, if the guy that did the analysis of the 775, are corruption, economic mismanagement, overextension of the military, corruption, competition, technology. Basically, we are flashing bright red on all 7 of the major indicators of a collapsing dollar. So to answer the question first, the issue isn't you need to get out of the dollar in any form, whether it's cash, check, or credit card. But to answer the other question about convenience, this is the thing it's frustrating for me, and this is a longer conversation, but crypto, the right version of crypto, is actually a better, more convenient, and easier to use form of money. mean, digital currencies, the original idea behind the Bitcoin white paper, and there's a civil war within the Bitcoin community, but the original vision as outlined in Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper for Bitcoin is to create peer-to-peer cash, digital cash that people can use for day-to-day transactions that doesn't require banks, doesn't require central banks, and doesn't require governments. And the payments themselves are nearly instant with nobody in between. So the reality is that crypto, if implemented properly, is as convenient, if not more convenient, than credit cards or debit cards. And so there are alternatives to this existing system, but we have to get out of the dollar, because it's the dollar that's going to be turned into a central bank digital currency. And in fact, I suspect it's a controlled demolition where at some point there's going to be an emergency and people are going to be told that they're forced to convert to CBDC or lose their existing cash. So my major point here is one about getting out of the dollar, and then how you do that is a whole other process, which I outline in my book, and I'm now doing 4-hour workshops on, because my goal isn't to scare people about CBDCs, it's to actually help empower people and get them actually using these alternatives and get them started along the way.
Right. So just to kind of give you a little quick promo here, this is your link to your page here, day 2024. And people can get the book and or find the workshop, The Future of Money in a CBDC World, Financial Freedom or Digital Prison. And then the book is here up on Amazon. I've got a few of your chapter headings listed here for people to look at, but they can find it themselves on Amazon. So you bring up a lot of interesting points. I mean, one of my sons is in finance, and we went skiing the other day, and the car ride back and forth, a lot of this kind of talk coincident. I wasn't really thinking about our conversation today, but I was asking some similar questions about whether you can kind of do your economy on Bitcoin and or crypto, and there's a distinction between the two. Maybe you can cover what that distinction is for some of the neophytes out there. But he felt that Bitcoin doesn't have its ledger updated quickly enough, and there's kind of a sweep that happens on a non-micro, nanosecond basis. And is it fast enough to handle exchanges and work its ledger up to the demands of a worldwide billion-person economy? A. B. In the realm of crypto, what does one do? Hedge kind of this thing, kind of go in the ETF world and so forth, but get completely out. And how do you manage that if you're not, say super smart such as oneself, such as you are?
Well, so I first got into Bitcoin in 2012 and was actually using Bitcoin I'm in New Hampshire, and New Hampshire actually has the highest per capita crypto usage in the world, at least at some point. I mean, there was actually a physical storefront called the Bitcoin Shop here, and there have been restaurants and merchants that were taking Bitcoin over a decade ago. There are a lot of distinctions to make within crypto. And in fact, to be clear, there are over 20,000 different coins. Most of them are Ponzi schemes or are not suitable alternatives for cash. So then we get into Bitcoin, and this is the hardest thing for me to explain. What people think of as Bitcoin, what the ETFs are and everything else, was hijacked. And there's a really interesting story, and there's a trial going on about this right now. But the white paper outlined digital cash, and at some point, Satoshi Nakamoto, who wrote the white paper, handed over the keys to the code to this other guy, Gavin Andreessen, and then at some point, short time after, they were basically taken and stripped from him, and a group of devs pushed Bitcoin in another direction and started spinning a narrative about digital gold as opposed to digital cash. Started saying things like, well, you're not supposed to use it for transactions. It's supposed to be a store of value. And then it turned into this whole speculative investment. However, the white paper outlined digital cash. There's a trial going on right now, which is fascinating. In fact, I've been watching it every day for the last 3 weeks. It's called COPA versus Craig Wright. And COPA stands for the Crypto Open Patent Alliance, which has a bunch of Silicon Valley companies and Jack Dorsey from Twitter and others, and Mark Zuckerberg was involved, versus Craig Wright, who claims to be Satoshi Nakamoto. And it's a fascinating story, which I could talk about this for hours. But the gist of it is there are things that are coming out of the trial, private emails between Satoshi and some of the earlier developers that have never been seen before, that prove definitively that Bitcoin was supposed to be about big blocks. It was supposed to be digital cash, not digital gold. And so what has happened since 2017, to me, is a tragedy. But the silver lining is that in 2017, people that wanted to sustain the original vision basically created a fork of Bitcoin. So you now have Bitcoin BTC, which is the one most people know about, BCH, which is Bitcoin Cash. And then there was another split between Bitcoin Cash and what's called Bitcoin Satoshi's Vision, which this guy, Craig Wright, who claims to be Satoshi, has rolled back to the original protocol. And now, as of yesterday, I saw they have it running up to 1.2 million transactions per second versus BTC, which does 7 transactions per second. So as to what your son was saying, the transactions can be instant. They can be virtually instant. And I'm not going to get into all the technical nuance of it, but it's something called SPV that allows for instantaneous transactions on chain. It was originally intended to be a replacement for cash, and that it's something that can scale to handle transactions. In fact, it's even more powerful than just handling transactions. There's an underlying infrastructure to this where you're going to be able to control your data and store your data on top of this. It's really about micropayments and everything else. And so it's much more profound what's in the white paper. And it's been turned into this digital gold concept, which is actually quite a shame. And I wrote an article about this for Brownstone that Zero Hedge picked up as well. There are some alarming things regarding who's been behind changing Bitcoin from digital cash to digital gold. This MIT Multimedia Lab, whose chair is a guy by the name of Joi Ito, was caught taking money from Jeffrey Epstein. And this was well after Jeffrey Epstein had been caught. They knew they were taking money from Jeffrey Epstein, and they knew what Jeffrey Epstein's past was. Well, Jeffrey Epstein did one interview on this. There's only one, but he basically said in 2017, he didn't see Bitcoin as a currency. He saw it as digital gold. And right at about that time, the Joi Ito guy from MIT was not only funding projects through MIT, but he was personally taking Epstein money. And I don't know for sure if it was allocated to this, but he funded some of the developers that made the change to Bitcoin, that made it Bitcoin gold instead of digital cash. And so on top of that, all 3 of the US CBDC pilot programs have MIT Multimedia Lab involvement in them. And there's an overlap between the developers that work on, I'll say, hobbling Bitcoin and the US CBDC that replaces digital cash. So it's of course, no one knows about this because this isn't, no one, writes about this because the financial press and everybody else is more interested in the price of Bitcoin and ETFs and everything else. But it's actually a very frustrating story for those of us that have been in this for a long time and have been interested in crypto and Bitcoin as a solution to the central banking problem and governments that print money into oblivion and crash society.
Yeah. So there's a lot there to unpack. I might just ask, can these other variants of Bitcoin serve as, reasonable currency themselves? And I kind of would, maybe talk about these death of currencies. I think the inflationary urge is omnipresent with nations that are want to buy things for themselves, their cronies and whatnot. And the easiest way to do that is not tax people, because people are aware the taxes go up, but just to print more money. That seems to be the central benefit, say, of Bitcoin. A lot of these other cryptos potentially, but you can correct me on this, is that there's a control of the amount of specie out there in a sense. And is that a benefit or a holdback for something like Bitcoin and or the current, the cryptos? And is that kind of the way of all flesh for the fiat currencies, that they always wind up, self-inflating because of the, easy way of kind of solving problems immediately by just printing money, as we saw during COVID?
Fiat currencies always go this way. I mean, literally 100% of the time. There's no example of a fiat currency that didn't end up getting debased into oblivion, and then the state collapsing. So we're not doing anything unique. To me, everybody says, well, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And yet people still want to continue with this fiat currency model, knowing it has a 100% failure rate. I think the limited supply of Bitcoin is certainly a feature. I mean, how many of them you can have simultaneously is an issue. But the problem with BTC as digital gold is people need something that they can actually spend. And I will say I'm very worried about the Bitcoin ETFs, and this relates to a bigger theme. So when I say I'm worried about CBDCs, I'm worried for several reasons. Globally, if you go back to 2020, there were 30 countries that were just at the researching CBDC stage. Fast forward to today, there are 130 countries working on CBDCs. 11 countries have already implemented CBDCs. There are 1.3 billion CBDC accounts globally, which is now more than the number of decentralized cryptocurrency accounts. And then people will say to me, well, yeah, but this is way off as far as the United States is concerned. And that isn't true. As I mentioned earlier, the US has done 3 successful CBDC pilots, all with this MIT multimedia group. But these are very advanced pilots. The Project Hamilton is probably the most important one from the standpoint of this is the retail version. This would be the version that replaces cash. They did a pilot from 2020 to 2022, and they were able to get this CBDC pilot to do 1.7 million transactions per second. To put this in relation, the current financial system only does about 50,000, maybe 100,000 transactions per second. So they have built a replacement for the existing financial system, and the technology is sitting on the shelf. They said at the conclusion of the pilot that we've worked out how it works technically. Now it's just a matter of marketing and the legal aspects of it. So that's one of the pilots. The second pilot is called Project Cedar, and it is what's known as a wholesale CBDC. So this is a CBDC that allows banks to send larger amounts of money back and forth to one another, and it has particular use for cross-border transactions because it's very expensive and very time-consuming to do international finance just with currency, trading currency and everything else. So that pilot is done. And the worst of the 3 is called Regulated Liability Network. Regulated Liability Network is basically one ledger that tracks all CBDCs and non-CBDCs in one place and allows for one or more regulatory agencies to monitor and censor these transactions. I've actually spoken just a couple of weeks ago with one of the developers on these CBDCs, and he actually confirmed to me that the Project Hamilton that I mentioned before has gone even to the next level. It now does 1.8 million transactions per second, but that there's every intention that if they implement or when they implement a CBDC, it will be part of this regulated liability network so that they can track everything CBDC and non-CBDC related. So that is the state. That is the state of the technology. And if you listen to the news, if you listen to Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, he'll tell you that they haven't even decided if they're really interested in exploring this. And the reality is they've already developed the technology. And so this is the gap that we have. In running for president.
This is like the Wuhan phase of the virus.
Well, it really is, and so this is why I'm alerting people to this, because having I exited fiat in 2019. And in fact, I'd kind of given up on the political process entirely after having been a political activist for quite some time. And I saw a couple of things happen. One, I was interested in understanding what the cause of COVID tyranny was. And then two, I wanted to understand why the government was cracking down on cryptocurrency. The person who introduced me to crypto in 2012, his name's Ian Freeman. My wife and I went to his sentencing hearing. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for selling Bitcoin. And he's a liberty activist who had a radio show. He actually had a lawyer that had gave him an opinion letter that said that he didn't have to have have a money transmission license. He actually went through all of the steps, and 5 departments of the federal government were involved in a multi-year investigation. They came in and basically with a bearcat stormed in, and seized all of his stuff, went after him, not only for illegally selling Bitcoin, but they actually charged him with the crimes of his customers. So people that he sold Bitcoin to, he was held liable for their activities. And in particular, there was a client of his that was apparently involved in romance scams, basically, conning old women out of their money. The FBI never found the person that did the romance scams. Ian didn't even know who this person was. And yet Ian was not only held responsible in terms of his prison sentence, he was ordered to pay $3.4 million in restitution, and they seized the rest of his assets. And so that happened. And then another friend of mine started a company called Library, which you might know as Odyssey. It's a website. It's basically a version of YouTube that is censorship resistant. The SEC targeted him and destroyed his business. Completely destroyed his business. They had to shut it down. It went into bankruptcy. I don't even know who bought it now. It still exists, but not in the original form. So I wanted to understand what the root cause of all of this. And that's when I realized that they're cracking down on crypto, not because crypto is a threat or people are getting ripped off or it's being overly used in money laundering or terrorism. They're shutting it down to usher in CBDC. And in particular, on March the 9th, 2022, President Biden signed Executive Order 14067. And that executive order calls for 2 things. It calls for the United States to explore a CBDC while simultaneously taking a whole of government approach to regulating all digital assets. And that is what they have been doing very aggressively. So now the state of the world is that executive order is live. The crackdown on crypto is happening. Exchanges, people are going to prison. They're shutting down on people's ability to even buy and sell cryptocurrency in person. And I spoke to other presidential candidates, but also active members of Congress that are anti-CBDC. And by the way, there aren't many, but one of the ones that I spoke with was Ted Cruz. And Ted Cruz just put in a bill yesterday, but it's a bill he's reintroduced, which is to stop the Federal Reserve from issuing a CBDC. His concern is that the Federal Reserve will actually act unilaterally and implement a CBDC without going through Congress. He's so worried about it that that's actually the reason that he put forward his piece of legislation. But he told me it's dead on arrival. He said there's no way it's going to pass. The votes aren't there.
His bill won't pass?
Yeah, he said his bill won't pass. I spoke at a conference with him, and he said it's dead on arrival. He's brought it in before. He said the people in the Senate don't understand the issue at all, and so it's not stopping him from introducing it. But to be very clear, we know where Biden is. Biden already has an executive order authorizing this. So is he going to pass this with a veto-proof majority? I think there's a 0% chance of that happening. Furthermore, I think that there's a real shot that we get CBDCs implemented this year based on everything that's going on and the rapid development of this. And it'll be very easy for them to pass it. There'll be a terrorist attack or a cyber attack. And what they'll say is to stop money laundering and to stop terrorism, we have to implement a CBDC because these evil players are either using physical cash or they're using cryptocurrency. And so we have to shut both of those things off to keep people safe. And so just like the Patriot Act, just like TARP, just like the CARES Act, it will be passed in an emergency, probably in under 2 weeks, with bipartisan support. I'm very worried about that because that's actually a likely scenario when you look at the history of how we get this type of emergency legislation.
So to outlaw something doesn't make it not exist. I mean, heroin has been outlawed. You know, there's all kinds of things that are outlawed and people still do. So if you got rid of made got rid of made gasoline illegal, it would still be a very useful fuel. What's the scenario? What does that actually look like to make these cryptos and the dollar ostensibly illegal? What are people going to do? How do they go from zero to not starving? In a matter of days or whatever, transfer and so forth. How does that all work out?
Well, I don't know how they'll implement it. I do know that the Federal Reserve implemented something called FedNow last year, which is a big upgrade to the infrastructure for banks that allows banks to settle in real time with each other. So it's not a CBDC itself, but it's the infrastructure on which you could build a CBDC. And that was rolled out in July of last year. So I'm saying that only to say they're putting in place the pieces to be able to act on an emergency basis. But I mean, there are certainly other examples in other countries that have been slowly reducing physical. I mean, we've already been reducing. Most people do not use physical cash. I mean, the percentage of transactions now that are done using physical cash is already minimal. Most people are using. I mean, even EBT and welfare programs are distributed on cards now. So I think that it's. There are people that are in the underground economy that are unbanked that are using cash. Those are the people that are actually going to be hurt the most when something like this happens. But I mean, if they can get people to take a vaccine for, a donut, what's it going to take? And they'll sell convenience and financial inclusion. I mean, they already have their version of the marketing down. I mean, their version of the marketing is going to be, we have to do this to keep us safe. And it's going to be financially inclusive and it's going to be convenient, even though in reality, it's all about control. So what are people going to do? Do we think people are going to resist? I hope they do, but we don't have a great track record.
All right. So can they make all these cryptos illegal? I mean, I suppose they can. They can just say it, and then if you have them, are you basically keeping heroin in your household? I mean, how does it all work out? And what does Aaron Day do now and later? I mean, I'm curious what you do on a day-to-day basis. If you are engaging or getting your book sold on Amazon, you get paid, I assume, in dollars. How does it all work out on a physical basis for you now? And then what would you do in this kind of post WAF CBDC apocalyptic scenario?
Well, my goal is to make sure that there is no post WEF scenario. So I'm putting all my effort into trying to make sure that this doesn't happen. And the way that happens is if 2 to 3% of the population exited fiat and moved to these alternatives, it would basically crash their system and give us the leverage to have control over the negotiations of whether we get forced to have CBDC or not. It's not an easy process necessarily using crypto. To your point about the ban, and this is, so the actual precedent is already there for banning cash. In 1933, the US dollar was backed by gold. We had the gold standard, and FDR confiscated gold. But what people don't understand about that is he actually only confiscated 75% of the gold. So if your gold was in a bank or a third-party vault, that gold was automatically seized. But 25% of the gold wasn't seized. And so individuals that managed to keep gold in their own self-custody, yes, they were legally required by law to exchange their gold for $35 an ounce, but many did not, and many held that gold. That is the same analogy that we have here. And so what I recommend to people is when you buy cryptocurrency, convert it or have a wallet where you have it in your own possession. Do not keep the cryptocurrency on an exchange, because the exchanges are like the vaults or the safety deposits during FDR's time. It can be seized, very easily through these third parties. I happen to think now, knowing that the government is implementing a whole of government crackdown on crypto, you'd ask yourself, well, why did they approve these ETFs? I actually think the ETFs are basically a plan to confiscate Bitcoin, because now you have people that are investing billions of dollars in these ETFs. You're not getting possession of the Bitcoin. And in fact, when you sell your ownership of the ETF, you don't get paid in Bitcoin, you get paid in cash. So now billions and billions of dollars are being centralized through these ETFs. 90% of the Bitcoin held by the ETFs is held through one exchange called Coinbase. Coinbase is currently being actively sued by the SEC. So I think that the idea, so people are all excited about these Bitcoin ETFs. And to the extent that Bitcoin is supposed to be an alternative to cash, having BlackRock hoard all of the BTC and then store it in a centralized exchange is about as far away from the concept of having peer-to-peer cash as you can get. And I personally believe it's a backdoor for confiscation. So this is a very tricky situation for me. I mean, hey, I may be wrong about everything that I'm saying, but I believe it. I mean, I actually lived in a 6,000 square foot house and scaled everything down. All my possessions now fit into 2 suitcases, and I'm in crypto, gold, and silver. And when and I say this personally, I still have some business stuff. Like, so if I sell books, I'm selling books through a corporation, and then I can convert the fiat into crypto. But I personally am fully in crypto, gold, and silver, and it's not convenient. And in fact, part of the challenge with it is you can buy gift cards, you can buy debit cards with crypto and use that to do transactions. But a lot of the banking relationships change, and it's something that I have to stay on top of. So it has not been a convenient, but I've done it to stay on top and to understand how this works, knowing that I want to be able to help educate others on how to do this if and when the emergency strikes, which I think we're at that point now. So, but this is the problem. Most people publicly think that Bitcoin ETFs are great, and they have this idea that this is digital gold, but it's absurd. The idea that
of course it's a meta, thing. It's like my watching a movie about a bird. I mean, I'm not flying. I'm watching. It's kind of an abstraction, a vicarious aspect. So I get that, and I understand kind of the peer-to-peer part. But there's this whole wash. I mean, if you're not doing this as your own personal quest, it's a difficult thing. There's so many issues and kind of activist quests to follow on a day-to-day basis. It's and those of us who are trying to pursue other work and whatnot, it's hard to do that unless you're completely devoted to it. So in the Aaron Day best case scenario for us, for freedom and whatnot, you're thinking of having some kind of reasonable ballast of a couple percent of the population doing transactions such as Aaron Day does, flipping into gift cards and whatnot, or what is the actual form of protest, and how would it reverberate in which of these crypto fields, since there are 20,000 of them, which one do you buy into without getting Ponzi'd?
So the dollar is going to collapse, and the banking system is going to collapse, and it's a controlled demolition, and it's already ongoing. And just to back up on that, to further that point, as I mentioned, all fiat currencies collapse. But if you want to look at what's happened to the dollar has lost now 99% of its purchasing power since 1913. So a lot of people talk about how bad these cryptos are. You compare a chart of a lot of these cryptos to the purchasing power of the dollar, and the dollar isn't as good as a lot of what would be considered mediocre altcoins. But beyond that, I mentioned earlier, FDR moved us. We had a gold standard, but then FDR confiscated the gold. And then in 1972, Nixon took us off the gold standard. So now the dollar's backed by nothing. And by 1992, we have what's called a fractional reserve banking system. So your bank, starting in 1992, or actually, well, not starting in 1992, but in 1992, banks were required to have 10% of customer deposits on reserve. So most people aren't taking their cash out. Most people are keeping their money in the bank accounts, and they're using the bank accounts to do transactions. So the banks didn't need to have all of the money in reserve. And so this is what gives them the ability to loan out the money and operate the banking business. It's a little sketchy in and of itself, the fractional reserve nature of it. But thanks to COVID legislation in 2020, the Federal Reserve actually waived the 10% reserve requirement. So now your bank is not required to have any reserves. So now let's walk this through. Okay, how does your bank make money? If you want to go in and withdraw money, where does the bank get its money? Well, the bank gets its money from principal and interest payments. On what? Well, banks' primary lines of business are commercial real estate, which is collapsing, residential real estate, which is starting to show signs of weakness, auto loans and credit cards, which are now at 2008 level default levels, student loans, which when they paused student loans during COVID, but once they restarted the repayment on these student loans right out of the gates, 46% said they weren't going to pay, they were going to default. So the banking system is backed by nothing, has no reserve requirements, and everything that they're relying on for payments is defaulting. So that is the actual state of the banking system. They know that, and what they're operating under is this typical problem reaction solution model, where they create a crisis, generate a reaction, which is usually fear, and then they already have the solution, and their solution is already CBDC. So the gist of my argument here is we need an alternative solution, and the alternative solution is to get a certain percentage of people into self-custody crypto, gold, and silver. It will actually crash the system slightly faster than they're planning on it. But it'll show people that there's an alternative way to do things in the interim so that they don't get stuck with CBDCs. So that's essentially the thinking behind it. Now, this is not a solution. This is a stopgap measure. And there's a whole other part to this, which is, well, why are they doing this? And I think this actually ties in COVID and everything else. There truly is and has been for probably 100 years, but more specifically the last 50 years, a coordinated effort to move towards more centralization, to move more towards a one world government with a CBDC and social credit scores. That's actually the bigger default situation. So we have a series of these problem reaction solution scenarios: COVID, the last financial crisis, what's happening with the financial system now, and the banking collapse. But the end goal of this is more centralization and more of a move towards digital tyranny. Exiting the dollar stops the CBDC thing, but we still need to have an alternate solution to, what is the obvious decay and collapse of the U.S. at this point in time.
Well, that's a lot to take in. So because let's say people are watching this late at night and they want to still have a good night's sleep. What is it? What's your best case scenario? It sounds almost like inevitable that because we have more digital things, cash is not as easy as swiping and whatnot. Well, I'll try to make a slightly different question. The CBDC, are these going to be government by government, or is it going to be some world euro, renminbi, or dollar, whatever mashup? Are we going to form into like a central, what I might call a CBDC, some centralized central bank digital currency? Is there one currency, one world, one government? And then if that happens, what keeps them from not, wanting to, inflate that whenever they want, whoever they might be?
Well, this is a longer. So I can answer some of this, and I know this is the part that's hard for people to understand. When you say this, it's like, oh, this is a conspiracy theory, which is why it's really not. This is why I put it in my book. You can actually look at the history of the UN. You can see quotes from the founders of the UN. You can see quotes from H.G. Wells, who was part of the League of Nations and an early advocate for promoting the United Nations. There are you can obviously see the quotes from Klaus Schwab and others. And in particular, in 1972, the Trilateral Commission was formed with David Rockefeller and Brzezinski, and that actually really kicked off the modern day movement towards globalization and the erosion of sovereign boundaries. And they've had a heavy influence on the United Nations. And so if you want to see what the end form of this looks like, take a look at the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, where they outline plans to basically centrally control everything from how you live, healthcare, education, energy policy, the regulation of the land, the air, the sea. If you actually take those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which I've done as an intellectual exercise, and turn it into a social credit system where you're monitoring and rewarding and punishing people based on your kind of worldview of how those things work, it looks a lot like the social credit system that's already been implemented in China. And so I go into detail of this in the book, and people aren't aware of this entire what's called a technocracy movement. And technocracy is a form of social organization where basically elites pick scientists and engineers to make decisions for people. And I'm going to give them the most charitable explanation and viewpoint. Their viewpoint is we have a scarcity problem. We are going to destroy ourselves. We are going to destroy the planet, and that we can perfect man through the application of technology and solve all of these existential problems. But the only way to do it is to have the best scientists and engineers making decisions for everybody. That is actually the basis of all of this. So you'll see Yuval Harari talk about, this is the end of free will. You will see in these WEF conferences all kinds of discussions about technology and transhumanism. So it's moving towards this. As to your question so ultimately there will be one global CBDC if they're successful at implementing this, and they're already putting the infrastructure in place for this. So I mentioned we have our CBDC. There are all these other CBDC programs going on, but there are two programs going on, one by the Bank of International Settlements and this other regulated liability network, which are basically providing an interface and an infrastructure for CBDCs to be able to be traded amongst one another. But there's a movement towards one coin, and the IMF is already heading up, working with the BIS, what a global CBDC might look like. Now, fascinating, if you go back and you study the history of technocracy, in 1931, when this movement got started, the basis of technocracy is not only to have elites running things, but it's to completely transform the economic system to one based on price, to one being based on energy. So the idea of energy credits as the basis for currency for the economy goes all the way back to 1931. So when you see this ESG movement, and you asked, well, how will they inflate? Will they inflate this? Well, you got to understand something. In this new world order, you don't have property rights. You don't have individual rights. Your conception of what your portfolio is, what your career is, what your job is, you have to throw all that away. You're living in a top-down controlled reality with a social credit system and a currency based on energy. And the energy choices and what's even possible from an energy perspective is narrowly defined by what the elites think is possible. And that what they think is possible is based on a heavy scarcity mindset.
So just to go over that last phrase, based on a scarcity mindset. So this is the presumption that I assume you're familiar with the wager or the bet between Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich in it was the late 70s, early 80s. Are you familiar with that?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Well, I don't know. I haven't posed the question yet, but maybe you can intuit one. But Ehrlich was the population bomb, and this kind of scarcity model, and Julian Simon is kind of like the George Gilder, type of basically the major currency of mankind is ingenuity, and we have the same items out in the world. The caveman had sand. We have glass. They had iron. We have wires and electricity. we can take sand and iron and put it into this computer and whip it up with some dead dinosaurs and talk hundreds of miles away instantaneously. Anyway, so knowledge is basically the actual currency, and ingenuity is the way in which we all become wealthy. And the kind of the Malthusian Paul Ehrlich population bomb terrified, fearful model is that we're always running out of everything. The situation is desperate as usual. To quote, I think it was Tom Robbins in the even Cowgirls Get the Blues back in the day. But everything, it's the kind of the Al Gore, the seas will rise, we're all going to be starving, Greta Thunberg kind of thing. Is that am I right in that? Is that the scarcity model we're talking about?
That is absolutely the scarcity model, and in fact, I mean, you can see this with the WEF. There are the groups that you see up front, like the WEF, the UN, etc. But there are groups behind the scenes, like the Trilateral Commission, and more importantly, the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome is a group that has really been pushing this scarcity approach for decades, and that's what influences ESG. That's what influences a lot of this policy. So the people that are pushing this technocratic vision are very much based on this scarcity approach. And you even see this carried through in, I don't know if you know this or not, but there's a new food pyramid, if you will, that's been designed called the Lancet model. And I think the USDA helped contribute to the obesity and diabetes epidemic enough with their 1992 food pyramid. But this new food pyramid by Lancet, when you read it, optimizing human health isn't actually a top criteria. They're actually looking at these 17 sustainable development goals, and they're factoring those goals in when coming up with nutritional standards. So this new food outline has very little, almost no red meat. It has the introduction of insect-based things. It even includes sugar, which makes absolutely no sense. But there's nothing about this diet that is even intended to optimize human health. It's all based on this broader, we have to consider how all of these things holistically integrate these 17 sustainable development goals. And what I like to say is the problem with this, and let me be very clear, I think this technocracy thing will fail, but they might destroy human civilization in the process. And I think what's at battle here, I try to summarize this very as succinctly as I can. This is a battle of free will versus determinism. It's a battle of abundance versus scarcity. It's a battle of a mindset that's based on love or based on fear, or decentralized versus centralized. Those are the stakes. To me, that is the battleground. And the problem is, even if you assume good intent, which some and I'm not going to delve into any of the conspiracy theories here. Even if you assume that they have good intent, the problem is that it's a combination of arrogance and fear. Because, if you're looking like at a pie chart, there's the stuff that there's the stuff you don't know, and then there's the stuff you don't know. And the stuff that you don't know is infinite in comparison to the other slices of the pie. But for the elite technocrats pushing this, they think that all of human knowledge is based on what they know, and only they uniquely know. So they are missing out on basically the entirety of the unknown, and which to me is where the magic happens. That's where invention happens. And so this is why I think their model is fundamentally flawed, even if they have good intent. And it's not as though their approach hasn't been tried before. I mean, you mentioned Malthus. I mean, Malthus had a comment. He was worried about the overuse of resources to the point where he was promoting depopulation. One of his quotes is, "Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague." At one point, the commissioner of the patent office said everything that can be invented has been invented. So basically showing this, again, this idea of people who think that we know everything and that they know everything. But this top-down kind of scientific approach has been tried. Lysenko in the Soviet Union implemented what he thought was this pseudoscientific agricultural policies, and that led to the starvation of 7 million Soviets. The Great Leap Forward happened in China from 1958 to 1962, again, implementing modern technology and all kinds of practices. 30 to 45 million people died. And I'd argue Chernobyl is another example of technocracy. So I don't think it'll work, but what the chances of them, particularly, at least in these isolated cases, these were just singular countries that collapsed. These people want to move everything to a one government scenario, and I think the one government will reach a similar form of and level of collapse.
Yeah, no, I think one government is a great idea as long as it's me in charge. I might have you as my. Maybe it should be the other way around. Maybe you should be the president. I could be. Just joking, but we see this kind of like idealistic one world vision. I don't want to get too political and current day per se, but there's this little tiny war going on in Israel between Hamas and Israel, or Gaza and Israel, Palestine is whatever you want to call it. And so how does one world government work out when we have hugely different ways of looking at the world? And along those lines, is it likely that Iran wants to be part of the CBDC? I watched Konstantin Kisin, and he's got his I think it's Trigonometry podcast, but he talks about how a lot of the virtue signaling that goes on in the UK only winds up offloading their pollution to China, say. In the case of if we can make an analogy here to the CBDC, is it just another case that's want to, kind of Greta Thunberging our virtue, and we're all going to eat worms and be happy and so forth, while other countries that are not participating in this are going to be taking up the slack, as it were, and doing anything, kind of along their lines, and they don't necessarily want to be in the one world government, be managed with us. I mean, it's easy once you have stuff to say, oh, I have enough and whatever. But the places, say, sub-Saharan Africa, do they want to be part of this when they don't have enough already? And are they going to be limited, in a sense, the same way that COVID did? We locked down the world, and locking down the world, in Belgium, maybe you have enough stuff to kind of get by and whatnot. But you lock down the world in places, like, the Congo or Zaire, whatever they're calling it these days. I think it's back to the Congo, but would bring about starvation and the kind of the cut down in trade and whatnot. So, is this a feasible thing? Is the result or the revolt going to happen from unlikely places? How do you kind of see that playing out on a country to country basis when not everyone wants to be under the same rule of law unless it's their own? I mean, the Islamic Republic of fill in the blank, we'll say, Afghanistan or Iran, they don't want to be under CBDC unless they are the C.
Well, I mean, what I can say, far be it for me to predict how it would all shape out. I just know what the forces that have been working on this for 5 decades are trying to do. But you can see the way that they've been doing it piece by piece. So, for instance, you mentioned, the 130 countries that are at various stages of development of their CBDCs right now represents 95% of the global GDP. So this is not a trivial component. So obviously, if you can get enough, they'll just take the rest by force, which certainly there's a historical precedent for that. But what's interesting when you look at a lot of these CBDC pilots, so there was one pilot that failed, and it's an interesting study as to why, but it was actually Nigeria. Nigeria implemented the CBDC, and I was actually on a Twitter space with some people from Nigeria, and they said, Aaron, why did they even try this? Like, nobody in Nigeria wants this. Nobody in the government understands it. We don't have the technological infrastructure for it. And like a lot of things, it was the World Bank and the IMF that were basically funding and forcing it on the Nigerian government. And those organizations, there's a group of organizations, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and the Bank of International Settlements. These are organizations that have been working kind of since World War II on trying to enforce a specific ideology on developing nations. And they've been doing that on everything from agricultural practices to healthcare to now finance. And so when you look at a lot of these pilots, they're in unlikely places. Now, it failed in Nigeria in part because it was poorly marketed, and because the head of the central bank, he's now in jail for I can't actually figure out exactly what it is, but it looks like it's fraudulent activity related to the CBDC rollout. So I have no doubt that they'll just learn from this experiment and try to figure out how to implement it again. So there very well may be pockets of resistance, but boy, there certainly wasn't enough resistance for COVID. And this is why I think in a bigger picture, COVID is just a dry run. What happened as part of COVID in terms of the surveillance infrastructure that was put in place globally for things like contact tracing, facial recognition, even for financial surveillance, that actually leveled up. If you look at from the perspective of they've got a 50-year ongoing plan to move towards one world government, but in order to do that, you have to put in place technology and infrastructure to be able to manage and control people. COVID leveled that up in a very significant way. In ways that people don't even understand. They look at COVID as being this one-off thing, but what was put in place behind the scenes is going to make the rollout of CBDC much easier. And then once CBDC is implemented, then vaccine passports and everything can be layered on top of it. It's essentially the basis for the control system.
I can see that. I'm kind of out of questions in a sense, but there's so much there to ponder. You were mentioning Rockefeller and whatnot. I've had on David Bell, also from Brownstone, and others. I think Ivor Cummins brought this up as well. That Rockefellers were part of instituting the WHO, and they were big in getting the United Nations formed. There's this One Health initiative as well, which I think resonates with some of your seven sustainability goals, which actually in and of itself sort of sounds Maoist. Yep. That we're going to be marching forward toward. To my general public, if you ever go watch the movie Mr. Jones, it's the New York Times reporter contemporaneous with Walter Duranty. Except I think he's just Stringer on the Times. Or he might have been an English newspaper, but the whole apparatus of everything's wonderful in the Soviet, according to the New York Times Durante, and he's kind of on the inside on the elite part. It's really an interesting play out of the way things work. If you're on the inside, everything's rosy. On the outside, people are suffering. There's the Holodomor in Ukraine, and it's the most gruesome thing. And Mr. Jones, the title character, winds up going off the grid in the sense of what he's supposed to be fed and things he's supposed to see, and he sees basically that the people who are ostensibly farming and whatnot are being sacrificed. Their goods are being taken away, and they are non-citizens in a sense. They're non-people, and they have to try to survive on their own. Certainly not thrive. Is this kind of this Hobbesian gritty self-warfare we're going to wind up having? Because I'm wondering, in one sense, once you do, get this into some perfect, John Kerry, Klaus Schwab, little tight ball of string where they control everybody and everything, all these transactions and whatnot. How is that hijacked? And somebody, kind of going by, and I'm sorry to do this little diatribe, but there's a famous, for me, it's a Simpson episode, one of the Treehouse of Horrors, where Lisa somehow gets everybody to relinquish all of their weapons all over the earth. So it's this really great goal. We become weapon free, no guns, no this, no that, no missiles and whatnot. And then Kang and Kong from the aliens, they come and they take over the whole world with a plank with a nail at the end, because they're the ones that have the only weapon left. So if everyone kind of is and again, slight diatribe, diversion, but one of the benefits, one of the things we saw during COVID that was a little bit of a break on the moment was kind of the federalist approach we have, the state by state. Florida was nicer place to be in than Pennsylvania, and I think South Dakota was better than North Dakota, vice versa. There are states that we were able to do experiments state by state. As these kind of firewalls get broken down and we get a big blur. It seems that there will be a central place, but that central place is ultimately going to be vulnerable because we're going to be run by humans in one level or another. And Kang and Kodos, I think it was, can come by with some stick. I mean, who's going to be the one who winds up kind of like taking this whole thing over and becomes Dr. Evil taking over the world.
Well, I mean, who knows? And certainly they'll fight amongst themselves, but it's very clear that they've been working towards this. I mean, it's not a theory. I mean, even if you go back to Rockefeller and the Trilateral Commission, Brzezinski wrote books about that. He wrote books about the technocratic age. In fact, I have the technocratic era involves the gradual appearance of a more controlled society. Such a society would be dominated by an elite, unrestrained by traditional values. I mean, these people have been pushing this type of agenda. How it works at the end, I don't know, but I think it needs to be stopped. And the way that it's stopped is actually through radical non-compliance. The problem is their system requires nearly 100% compliance. And so this is why voting doesn't fix this. And I could talk for hours about my experience in politics, but I can summarize it like this. If we think that we're winning politically, understand that the two front runners for president of the United States are the two people that got us into and sustained COVID tyranny. In 2022, 100% of incumbents were reelected to the United States Senate, and 94.5% of members of the House of Representatives were reelected. So we are going to have, there's no political change on the horizon. That's not even a possibility, which is why I say this isn't about politics anymore. This is about people taking individual action and working outside of the system instead of playing within a rigged system, thinking that the only choices you have are, I mean, I think I compared, Trump versus Biden is like the difference between the gas chamber and the electric chair. These aren't really choices. In fact, it's demoralizing to even make them. But there are individual actions that we can take to remove ourselves from the system and to be not reliant on these systems. And that's a path forward that buys us more time. This is something that I've been working on that I might put into a book, which is, so the point that I'm at, you brought up earlier, people are going on with their lives. And my position on this, which is more extreme than most, but I think America 1.0 is finished. I think it's a controlled demolition. I think that the problem reaction solution model is when there is the next problem, the solution they're going to roll out is, more centralized government. And that what we actually need is an alternative solution. We can't stop the problem that's going to be manufactured, and we can't stop the reaction, which is fear, that works every time. What we have to have is an alternative solution, because people will take these things. People will accept a vaccine. People will accept CBDC if given no other choice. And then, in fact, they'll rely on the fact that, well, I did these things because I didn't have a choice, or I was going to lose my job, or XYZ excuse, and they weren't presented with an alternative. What that means to me is that we have to admit that America 1.0 failed. And then we need to go through, in my opinion, a process of, did we fail because of something with our founding principles? Were our founding principles either wrong or inadequate? Or was it the way those principles were enacted and enforced through the Constitution? There's kind of a two-layer process, but I actually want to start a dialogue on that, because I feel like unless we can propose or have an alternative solution, we're going to get this other thing by default, because this other thing has been in the works for 50 years and has significant resources and planning behind it.
Well, I appreciate that. One thing that came to mind as you were speaking is that essentially God brought down the Soviet Union. When I say that, I mean Lech Walesa was, you kind of channeled Catholicism, and the old joke is, I think Stalin made about the Pope was, how many divisions does the Pope have? Well, apparently, the divisions are always out there amongst people, and use the other sense of the word. But when people have a motivation and a vision, they can do great things, and they can present the resistance. And it's I think Thatcher, Reagan, and Pope John Paul II helped overturn the Soviet Union. It's kind of so the way, when I hear you speak, and some of what you mentioned about your possessions, it may be a monastic and or religious quest you're on. How can people? First of all, is there a religion inherent in that? I mean, I imagine you're kind of on the libertarian side. I also would like to maybe give slight pushback on the non-difference between candidates. We do have the choices we have, and it's like the Super Bowl. You can go to the Super Bowl in a Jets jersey. Doesn't mean the Jets are going to win if they're not playing. And I do think that Trump came out against CBDC, and whether you think he's powerless to stop it is another question.
Well, he came out in part because of me. I gave Vivek Ramaswamy my book in June. Vivek and I had multiple conversations about it. I was actually pushing him to sign an anti-CBDC pledge. He dropped out in Iowa before the New Hampshire primary, which is where I am, and then he pushed Trump to change his position. So, but I don't believe Trump. Trump said he was going to drain the swamp. Trump said he was going to build a wall and have Mexico pay for it. Trump said he was going to. Trump's track record relative to his rhetoric is very poor.
Well, it's kind of like the lion tamers. Those guys, Schneider, Roy and Schneider, whatever it is. No, I get the name wrong. But the lion sometimes has a say too. You want to tame the lion, and you play around the lion. The lion also can bite. So I think draining the swamp was the intention. I think it was the direction. Building the wall was clearly the intention and the direction. I think that it's a lot to require one man. The Republican Party did not back him up. He had the House and the Senate the first 2 years, and they were not helpful. In getting.
But they're not going to back him up because we're going to have 96% the same people in Congress. And this is my and people are not. I know people are not ready to have this conversation. So when I say America 1.0 is over, part of this is based on when you look at every other nation state that has gotten to the point that we're at in terms of debt, military decay, all of the other stuff,
right.
They collapse. There's no turn. So this idea, like when Vivek goes around and says a 1776 moment is not a reorganization of an administrative state. A 1776 moment is building something new from first principles. It's going to take a lot. Most people are not going to be where I'm at on this. Well, I'm going to start the conversation about it. It's kind of like, being a serial entrepreneur. If you're trying to innovate something, you're not going to do it within General Motors. You're not going to work within a decaying bureaucratic organization and implement something new. The hard thing to do is to admit that something has gone wrong here. And so, people will say to me, well, are you throwing the baby out with the bathwater? If you actually look at it, we've lost most of our constitutional rights. We have the government surveilling us. We have the FBI. There's a great diagram by Andrew Lowenthal that shows the censorship industrial complex. We have multiple government agencies colluding with multiple nonprofits and all of big tech to censor our communications. Our First Amendment rights were absolutely suspended at the time we needed it most. We were not able to talk about life-saving ideas with respect to COVID and the COVID vaccines. And I think it's pretty clear, and I'm not going to delve into whether it was, the election wasn't, I don't know if the election was rigged at the ballot box, but certainly the censorship that happened on social media probably swayed the outcome of the election. So we're at the point where our voice isn't able to be heard even at the ballot box because the information that we receive is so heavily restricted. And you can go on and on and on and look through the Bill of Rights and going everything back from the Patriot Act to things that happened under TARP and everything else. But like we really aren't. And this is hard for people to accept. When you look at international rankings and where America is, because people will sit here and say, well, America is number one. America is number one for incarceration rate. We're number one for obesity, and that's actually about it. We really are. We aren't healthcare, education, not even innovation anymore. South Korea is there. We're as far as free speech, freedom of the press, we're not even in the top 10. And at some point, you have to admit that you can't. When I did run for president, I ran on the concept of truth and transformation. Unless you actually are willing to look at and accept the truth, you can't actually get to transformation. I think I heard somebody say somewhere, we've got to get to the truth before we get to the love, or we're loving the lies. And I think that we're in a state of, when somebody says we can still save America, having been in politics close to it for 30 years at all kinds of levels, knowing that elections are really all about a get out the vote apparatus that is controlled by the Republican and Democrat Party using big data and AI. Most voters, two-thirds of voters can't even identify the three branches of government. When you look at eighth graders, proficiency in history and civics is like below 30%. So we have part of the foundation of the country was that we had informed citizenry and civic virtue. That's completely dead. So when somebody says, well, we can fix this through this system, not based on how elections work, not based on the structure of the educational system and who votes that's been propagated over the last 50 years. And we're kind of like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic now. People can talk about, hope springs eternal, but I've run super PACs. Sit down and show me how, based on the current engagement and knowledge level of the voters and how the voting process actually works, show me a plan for how you can actually turn the ship around. And
yeah, well, it's always going to be a different ship. So that's the question I kind of asked about the monastic part is, in say Poland under the Soviet, people had they did not, well, they tried to close down the churches under Soviet, and they can't have an alternative religion. In a sense, you want people in part to be aware of all this, and obviously to fight back as much as they can. But given some aspect of a seeming inevitability, you want people to tunnel and kind of live their dual lives. The Jews under the Spanish Inquisition, they hid their Judaism, and I think they're called Marranos. At a certain point, they hid it for so long they weren't. There are people now in Spain, finding out that 6 generations ago they were Jewish or whatever, or 18 generations, and so forth, and they're completely unaware, and they go find some of the rituals and whatnot. But it's kind of I think that your prognostications, in the gross sense, I think are reasonable, and it seems to be with the direction we're headed on this. And it's just a difficulty. I understand, some of the propositions you're having. So on a kind of physical, easy basis, what do you recommend for people? Kind of 3 steps. Obviously, one is to buy your book or go to your workshop. But what can people do, and how can they further this message? And kind of just getting back to your situation of having everything in 2 suitcases. How is that feasible for people? And isn't that kind of a Klaus Schwabian kind of ideal? And how do the rest of us hope to manage without necessarily having the fervor and discipline of Aaron Day?
Well, so I mean, it's interesting. Again, the fact that everything I'm doing right now, I would have looked at myself 10 years ago and said, I'm nuts now. Like I would have never guessed that I'm doing any of the things that I'm doing right now. And in part, what you find, like when you go through a process of kind of getting rid of physical possessions, actually, you find you actually don't miss it. And in fact, these things were actually burdening you. Like that was a, and by the way, I was driven to do this before COVID. This actually started for me in 2019, and which is to give you a sense of where I was coming from. I mean, I was not only libertarian, I was an objectivist, running an objectivist organization, which is Ayn Rand's philosophy. So, which was, atheism. It's very much materialistic, and I am not that now. I went through this process in 2019, and part of the reason to do it is, I mean, obviously believe what I'm saying. I believe that there is this movement towards centralization, but what I've also learned is, I don't know the outcome. And the best way to prepare for the unknown is to be as flexible as possible. So to me, that is making sure that I don't have any reliance on the modern medical system, doing everything that I can to make sure I don't require any prescription drugs. It was paring down physical possessions. It was moving into crypto, gold, and silver. I did that. Again, understand this isn't the end state. I'm not even looking at there being an end state. I mean, if you embrace and appreciate the unknown, then, and you don't have any expectation of it necessarily even being like it was, because then when you go through this process, you examine what was, and you realize it wasn't all that great anyway, that you're not really leaving much, but people get attached to things. Then to me, it's kind of I think there's infinite possibility moving forward. So how can I be as dynamic as possible? What I'm doing now with this thing with CBDCs is I'm just trying to buy us more time. Again, it's not a utopian solution. This isn't a question about, I'm not doing this as a speculative asset. I'm not doing this as here's how you're going to make money. I'm saying that get some of this and start using it as money, alternative money, so that you can operate in a parallel economy and not be forced into complete tyranny. We still have to have that bigger conversation about what life looks like after this, and how do we structure society. And again, I would like to open that up as a discussion. I actually just recently gave a short presentation on this, and I've been writing an essay that I said I might turn into a book, because certainly I don't have any answers. I have a whole series of questions, and in fact, those questions come down to, I love the American founding principles. My favorite part of history is the American Revolutionary period. This is the area where I like to spend a lot of time, and I very much, and when you understand the context of the founding of America, what life was like before, under feudalism and with kings and so on and so forth. I know I sound negative on America, but we've abandoned the principles. We are so far removed. We went from a Revolutionary War on a 3% tax on tea to being in a position where people are paying 30 to 40% in taxes, and where we have $34 trillion worth of debt, and people are being locked down, mandated to inject poison, and have complete digital surveillance and censorship. That is so far removed from the founding principles that we have to first acknowledge that, but then we have to then go through a process to say, okay, but have we learned anything in 250 years about the nature of man, about the nature of governance? Are there other things, such as, like, for instance, with AI, if we get to the point where people don't have to work necessarily, where so much of our identity is attached to being a cog in an economic wheel, there are real concerns and things to address. So there's this big conversation I'd like to open up about foundational principles. And actually, it's difficult to even start that conversation. So I apologize if I'm a little muddled on it now, because
that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine. We're kind of a little bit over the hour, and I've enjoyed it. So the time is not really an issue. Just on a financial advisor basis, and you are not one per se. Maybe you are, but this is not financial advice for anybody, as a disclaimer for our podcast. But do you think it's reasonable to, the right word is, hedge against the decline in the dollar, just on a strictly economic basis, by moving more into crypto? Or would you compare that to the, say, the stock market writ large? What's kind of the best, say, financial outlook for preserving one's wealth in the meanwhile?
Well, again, mine is crypto, gold, and silver, all self-custody. So I would have no trust for any third parties, banks, or financial institutions, or even financial advisors. So I'm not a financial advisor, but I also don't trust financial advisors. And I say this as someone who when I exited politics and went into crypto and blockchain, one of the things that I was looking to do was take the blockchain technology that governs how Bitcoin works, and apply it to other areas of the economy, like stocks. For instance, people have no idea that when you buy a stock through your stockbroker, you don't own that physical share. All of the physical shares, 83% of the shares in publicly traded companies, are owned by one company called the DTCC. And we have a system that people would be shocked if they understood what underlies actually how the equities and bond market works. And in fact, there's this concept called the great taking that I've been exposed to recently. This whole idea of, if Wall Street basically gambles on derivatives and all these other contracts, and the shares that you have with your broker could be lost because of their gambling activities, because you, in fact, don't, based on the UCC codes and everything else, you don't actually have ownership of the shares at all. The shares aren't in your name. They're in the name of the broker. It's managed by a third party. And based on the way these contracts are written, you could actually lose your equities. So financial advisors, and this is why this is one of those things where you always have to say, or the SEC will crack down on you. You have to say, I'm not a financial advisor. This isn't financial advice. Well, in order to be a financial advisor, you have to go through a group called FINRA, and FINRA is basically it's a cartel of existing financial firms, but that has the power and the backing of the SEC to enforce their rules. So it's basically a cartel-like monopoly. So you have to go to a registered financial advisor to get advice. Those financial advisors are the guidelines are published by people that are in the financial industry pushing specific products, and it's the only place that you can go. And most of what people recommend, when you hear all of these things from your financial advisor, take your age minus 100 minus your age, and that's the percentage you should have in equities versus bonds. All of these like sayings and pithy statements and everything, these are all pushed by kind of a centralized thing. And it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. If you can only get financial advice that's of a certain type and everybody's recommending the same thing, then those investments go up until reality hits. And the entire US economy has been operating from this unique position coming out of World War II, where we had less debt than everyone else and enjoyed a position with the global reserve currency. But as you can see, a lot of that is now coming to the end, and financial advisors are still kind of pitching the same thing. So that's a bit of a diatribe, but again, I'm giving you the extreme position here. Hopefully I'm wrong. I should have prefaced this by saying I hope I'm wrong on all of this. I mean, I put together a book, and I challenge people to show me where I'm wrong, because I certainly, it would be great to go back to being an entrepreneur instead of going around and warning people about technocracy, digital tyranny, and the fact that everything's going to implode. But so far, since I published my book, everything that I wrote about in my book has actually gotten worse in terms of the surveillance state, the development of CBDCs, the implementation of social credit scores. And so it's one of these things I go through and revise the book. I'm like, wow, are you kidding me? As an example, in my book, I give the first chapter, this like dystopian science fiction thing of this is what things could look like in 2032. And it's, this family has a social credit score, and one member of the family's actions affect the others. And to help the family increase their social credit score, the husband opts for a euthanasia program, which boosts the whole. So it's a pretty dark thing. Yeah. But everything in that opening chapter is real in some sense. All of the surveillance and everything else. And so you look at the MAID program in Canada, where 10,000 people opted for euthanasia in 2022. That jumped to 13,800 or something last year. 4% of Canadian deaths are from state-assisted suicide. And now we're seeing, and I posted this today, people that are suffering vaccine injuries are being offered state-sponsored euthanasia in Canada. So when I say this is dystopian stuff, like it's worse. When you aggregate all together what's going on globally in various places, it's much worse than people, I think, would ever conceive.
So before we stop, I got one quick question. We retain our role as the U.S. as reserve currency, and things that haven't been great. I think we've mismanaged and so forth. But is it part of being, say, the tallest dwarf, that as bad as we are, the other places do worse? So there has not been a recalibration of our moving away from the U.S. dollar per se, because the other places are just as bad and or worse. We still have the United States, which is sort of a little bit of its own cruise ship, without as much in the way of border concerns as far as war goes, as say parts of Europe, Asia, and whatnot.
Well, I would say this. So the problem with this is, again, it's hot potato of let's go from global reserve fiat currency to global reserve fiat currency, and it fails every time. Again, the last 5 have lasted about 94 years each. We're not doing anything any differently, but with respect to the dollar being the global reserve currency, I think in the 80s, the dollar was used for 84% of international trade. It's already down to 58%. The BRICS nations are fully committed to getting off the dollar, and in fact might put together their own gold-backed currency. And it is estimated we will lose global reserve currency status by probably earlier than, but no later than 2030. And this is just based on what the developments are that are already ongoing. I mean, the usage of the dollar has absolutely fallen off a cliff, and now it's actually accelerating. And I go back to those 7 reasons why fiat currencies collapse. We're not doing anything any differently. I mean, you look at now we spend $900 trillion on defense. We spend $1 trillion a year on interest. We have social programs. We have entitlement programs that are absolutely unsustainable. These are I mean, the Romans did that. The Romans had unsustainable pension programs. The Romans ended up debasing their currency to the point where I think silver was 0.05% silver. A coin actually had 0.05% silver by the end. There's nothing different. That the sad part about it is that we aren't doing anything differently. We're just following the same pattern. And so what I'm trying to warn people about is, if we're holding on to this idea of American exceptionalism, it certainly isn't present in any of our economic, military, or political implementations currently.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, I know this is always uplifting, right? Like, but I am trying to sound an alarm because I see people waiting for elections, and I'm like, again, what do you think is going to change? Congress is going to be the same. The judges are going to be the same. There's not and that's assuming we don't get CBDCs before the election, which I think there's a high probability we get, in which case, then what are we going to do? And that Overton window keeps on moving to the point where it's, I don't know. I don't know how many more excuses we can make. Well, at least we're not forced to get the third booster. I mean, we need to go back to the throwing tea in the harbor over a 3% tax and not wherever it is we are today.
Well, it's a funny thing. Humans, that's amazing. I mean, we do so much more than say monkeys, chimps, or gorillas. But, we are not the perfect being. We fall prey to herd aspects and tribal aspects and group aspects. So I appreciate the individual thinking, and you've done a lot of it. So thank you very much for that. If people want to buy your book, here it is. It's The Final Countdown, and they can get it on Amazon. They can pay in cash or some other currency and whatever. Amazon has gift cards. And if you want to help support my podcast here, you can buy my book. It's unrelated. It's called Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. It's what's interesting about it, perhaps in theme, is that people get fed things and they're not necessarily true. And cui bono, who's benefited from Zika microcephaly, and why did it become the big going from panic to quasi-pandemic that it did in 2015-16? Is it aligned with certain interests, very similar to what we've been talking about, the sustainability aspects. There was a whole kind of NGO movement to overturn Brazil's abortion constraints, and it's a Catholic country historically, and they still have rules against abortion, as does a good part of Latin America. And Zika came along, and it became a reason for emergency injunctions to allow abortion. And they went to the Supreme Court of Brazil, and so it became kind of a political aspect, and for kind of cut down population, this and that. And this is the fact that you don't hear that it has not returned any microcephaly anywhere on Earth is in the meanwhile, and yet the theory still stands, is emblematic and misuse the word endemic of a problem where our experts and technocratic classes have let down the people, and they don't necessarily care that much about the individuals and the hundreds of millions of young families around the globe who have to either slather on insect repellent in the tropics and whatnot, or stay indoors under fear they're going to have a microcephalic baby, when this has probably never, ever been true. Zika is a real virus. It's a dengue virus, but dengue never caused microcephaly. And microcephaly is a real problem, but it's probably unrelated to any of these things. Anyway, that's my thing. I very much recommend people follow up with Aaron Day. You can find him on X. I have it up here. Pretty simple. Maybe expand this a little bit so people can see the Aaron R. Day. And I don't know, do you have any final words for our audience?
I mean, I would just say, well, you can also find me at day2024.com. That has the link to the books and the workshops and everything else. I know it sounds, everything that I say sounds pessimistic, but I'm actually not pessimistic. I think that there's an opportunity for us to to build something that's actually decentralized, based on love and free will, and abundance. I think that that's the outcome, but I think that we have to be honest about where we currently are, and we need to identify that there is a coordinated force that has a completely different outlook that also doesn't care about our perspective, doesn't care. We get caught up on our constitutional rights, and people are baffled when certain overreach happens. And what you have to realize is the people that are doing these things actually don't value constitutional rights, and the end game of their system will not involve the preservation of that. And so we have to be realistic.
I agree. I mean, a lot of what Obama did, people were like, why are you doing this? Well, it's just like, his ideal of, what might yours be of greater prosperity, growing the economy, weren't necessarily his. He had a different agenda. And is more centered on race and certain, qualifications. And his view of the United States wasn't the same as, say, mine and yours per se. And these things play out, as he said, elections have consequences. So I somewhat dispute, the AB, non-choice. I think there are elections do have consequences. And I recommend people go out and do the things they have to do. I have lots of libertarian friends, and those who abstain, I understand. And if it's not a swing state, it may not matter. But I do think that people still have to get involved and try to push the needle one way or another. And I commend you for bringing in front of Vivek Ramaswamy your book. And if it did move the needle for Mr. Trump, that's a salutary effect. So thank you very much, Aaron, for being with us. Thank you, Jeffrey Tucker and Brownstone, for having you on as a fellow, and I think that's going to be a rewarding situation for all parties.